Today, we're diving into one of the greatest stories of revenge in all of history. It's a story that kicks off with a nation's absolute worst defeat and ends with a single, personal vow that would literally change the course of the world.
It all gets started way back in 216 BC on a battlefield that pretty much became a graveyard. This is about a promise made in the ashes of a total disaster, a promise that would end up redrawing the entire map of the ancient world.
So, let's talk about this number. 80,000. That is the insane scale of Rome's loss at the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal Barca had just pulled off one of the most brilliant and frankly brutal moves in military history, wiping out a Roman army almost twice the size of his own. This wasn't just a loss, it was the single worst military disaster Rome had ever seen. Period.
In the middle of all that chaos and terror, a young military officer named Scipio manages to fight his way out. He finds the other survivors, and their morale is just gone. They're seriously talking about bailing on Italy, about giving up. But Scipio, he's got this fire inside him. He pulls out his sword and forces every one of them to swear they'll stay loyal to Rome, capping it off with that chilling threat. And right there, that's our hero.
Okay, so the Roman army is in tatters, and Hannibal? He's only a 5-day march from the city of Rome itself. You can just imagine the panic in the capital. Everybody knew this monster was at the gates, and Rome was basically defenseless.
And this is where things get truly desperate. I mean, look at what the Senate was doing. They were taking extreme measures. They started recruiting boys who were barely old enough to be called men. They were forcing the rich to give up their slaves to fill the ranks. And get this, for weapons and armor, they had to raid their own trophy cases, using the stuff they'd captured from enemies they had already beaten. This was the ragtag crew standing between Hannibal and total victory.
But here's where Hannibal made a huge mistake. See, he wasn't a Roman, and he didn't think like one. He just assumed that after a beatdown that bad, Rome would beg for peace. He wanted to negotiate. He waited for them to surrender. But the Romans just wouldn't do it. In fact, they passed a law making it illegal to pay a ransom for any of their captured soldiers. For them, the fight was far from over. So, while Rome is stubbornly digging in its heels, the war starts to shift. And for our guy, Scipio, things are about to get deeply, deeply personal. While he's fighting in Spain, both his father and his uncle get killed in battle. That grief just hardened into a relentless need for revenge. So when the Senate asks for a volunteer to take command in Spain, which everyone saw as a death sentence at this point, only one person steps up. Scipio. He's just 24, way too young for the job. But he demands it. This wasn't about glory for him. This was payback for his family and for Rome. The Senate didn't really have any other choice, so they said yes.
Now Scipio knew he couldn't win just by fighting like a typical Roman. That had failed over and over again. So he did something brilliant. He studied Hannibal. He studied his enemy's best move, that encirclement at Cannae, and he created his own version of it. He basically decided to beat Hannibal at his own game. This became his signature move.
And the Battle of Ilipa, man, this was his masterpiece. Here's how he pulled it off. For days, he lined his army up in the traditional way, making the Carthaginian commanders think they knew what was coming. Then, on the day of the battle, he flipped the script. He put his best soldiers on the flanks and used them to just smash the enemy's weaker sides. His own center, full of his weaker troops, just advanced slowly, pinning down the enemy's elite soldiers, who could do nothing but watch as their whole army fell apart around them. It was a complete victory, and it won Spain for Rome.
With Spain gone, Hannibal's supply lines were cut. His huge 15-year campaign in Italy just fizzled out. So Carthage called him home. It was time for one last desperate defense of the homeland. The stage was set for a final winner-take-all battle between the two greatest generals of the time. I mean, just look at this matchup. On one side, you have Hannibal, the 45-year-old legend who hasn't lost a battle on Italian soil in 15 years, and on the other, the 35-year-old challenger, Scipio, who's never lost a battle in Spain. This was basically the heavyweight championship of the ancient world. The fate of both their civilizations was on the line.
But Scipio had one terrifying, massive problem to solve. Hannibal's ace in the hole, 80 war elephants. These were the tanks of the ancient world, all lined up and ready to pulverize the Roman army. How in the world do you survive that?
Scipio's answer was just pure genius. Instead of trying to stop the unstoppable, he figured out a way to just let them pass right through his army. So here's how he did it. He arranged his soldiers in these deep columns with wide open lanes between them.
Then he hid the lanes with a thin screen of light troops. When the elephants charged, the screen just melted away, revealing these open channels. The elephants did what you'd expect. They took the path of least resistance and ran right down the funnels. And once they were trapped in there, the Romans hit them from both sides with javelins and blasted trumpets, which freaked them out. Some of them even turned around and trampled their own army. Just like that, Hannibal's greatest weapon was gone.
With the elephants and the cavalry out of the way, it all came down to a slugfest between the infantry. And get this, on one side, you have Hannibal's undefeated veterans from Italy. And on the other, Scipio's legions, which included the disgraced survivors from the disaster at Cannae. For 14 long years, those guys had been treated like outcasts. Now, they finally had a shot at redemption.
The battle was absolutely brutal, but then Scipio's cavalry returned, just as planned, and smashed into the back of Hannibal's line. It was a reverse Cannae. The numbers are just devastating. The Romans lost about 2,500 men. Carthage lost nearly 40,000. It was a crushing victory. Rome's revenge was finally complete.
But the story doesn't end there with a hero's parade. The aftermath is actually a pretty dark and ironic tale for both the winner and the loser. Hannibal spent the rest of his life on the run. The Romans just relentlessly hunted him down. Finally, at 64 years old, they had him cornered. With no way out, he drank a vial of poison he'd been carrying for years, basically delivering one last defiant message.
And what about Scipio, the hero who saved Rome? His story is just as tragic. He got back to Rome, and jealous rivals in the Senate accused him of corruption and hounded him out of public life. He ended up a bitter, broken man, dying in self-imposed exile and ordering that heartbreaking line to be put on his tomb.
So, fast forward 50 years. Carthage has bounced back. It's rich again. But its success just fuels Roman paranoia and greed. There's this one senator, Cato, who starts ending every single one of his speeches, no matter what it was about, with the phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." Eventually, Rome manufactures a reason for another war, tricks Carthage into giving up all its weapons, and then lays siege to the now defenseless city.
And the man who oversaw this final, brutal act was Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the great Scipio Africanus himself. A historian who was there said that as he watched the ancient city burn to the ground, he was weeping. When he was asked why he was crying after such a huge victory, Scipio gave this haunting reply. He knew. He understood that this cycle of violence that Rome had perfected could one day be turned back on Rome itself. Which leaves us with one final, chilling question. In the end, what is the true price of total revenge?